Good evening, and welcome to Skep Talk, the monthly speaker series hosted by the Bay Area Skeptics. Before tonight's presentation, a few words about Bay Area Skeptics. As North America's oldest skeptical organization, we are dedicated to promoting critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, scientists such as Carl Sagan and magicians such as James Randi established the scientific skepticism movement out of concern about the popular fondness for pseudoscience and the lack of public science literacy. Scientific skepticism embraces evidence-based civil discourse on health, education, consumer protection, and especially the investigation of extraordinary claims. Using the scientific method, we hope to promote skeptical inquiry to reduce irrational thinking in society. This talk is supported by Bay Area Skeptics members such as you. Please visit us at baskeptics.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Meetup. Consider supporting us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our annual Skeptical Conference. But more importantly, members help us make the world just a little more reasonable and rational. And now, tonight's speaker.
Good evening. I'm Eugenie Scott. I'm president of Bay Area Skeptics. Our Bay Area Skeptics Skep Talks don't usually have more than one speaker, but we've got a double header tonight. I want to welcome Doctors Trollinger, William and Sue. Both of our speakers tonight are professors at the University of Dayton in Ohio. Sue in the Department of English and Bill in History and Religious Studies. A student and teacher of rhetoric, Sue has extensively researched Amish life, including publishing a book, Selling the Amish, The Tourism of Nostalgia. Her work concerns the ways the Amish interact with mainstream American culture and how mainstream American culture interacts with the Amish. I was familiar with Michael Bunker's Pennsylvania series of Amish science fiction novels, but it wasn't until I worked on this introduction that I learned about the existence of many other Amish fiction genres, including mysteries, true crime, westerns, and even romances. I'm not making this up. The Amish romance novel collectively are referred to as bonnet rippers rather than bodice rippers, and that just makes me very happy. Bill Trollinger studied at the University of Wisconsin-Madison under the person who, in my opinion, is the preeminent historian of the creationist movement, the late Ronald Numbers, whom I'm sure both of us miss terribly. So Bill has had an interest in American creationism and fundamentalism for a long time and has published widely on this subject, including a biography of William Bell Riley, who, if you know anything about the history of either fundamentalism or creationism, is a very familiar name. The Doctors Trollinger have joined forces in studying American creationism and co-authored a book, Writing America at the Creation Museum. They have studied in detail the entertainment complex in northern Kentucky, built by the Young Earth creationist organization Answers in Genesis, which includes the Creation Museum and, more recently, the Ark Experience, a full-scale model of what biblical literalists believe Noah's Ark looked like. I'm sure they'll show us pictures of it. It is really big. Recently, they have expanded their consideration of the creationist movement to look at the relationship between creationism and conspiracism, and links between creationist conspiracism and other conspiracisms such as climate change denial, vaccination, and QAnon. This is the topic of their talk tonight with us, From Creationism to QAnon, Answers in Genesis and the Culture War. Bill and Sue, welcome very much to Bay Area Skeptics. Thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you. We are, it's such an honor to be here with you tonight. We're so grateful to Eugenie Scott and Jay Diamond, who's making all the tech possible, and Glenn Branch, a good friend, for making this happen. We're really grateful.
Yes, it was Glenn who told me about your work, so I'm very grateful to him. He was going to try to watch tonight, but he had some other things, but I'm sure he'll catch you later. Okay, I have to ask you a question, Sue.
Okay.
Because this is, after all, the Bay Area Skeptics, right?
Okay.
Is there an Amish paranormal genre?
Not that I'm aware of.
It would seem to be really discordant, but I had to ask because we're Bay Area skeptics. What can I say?
But they do really love the Creation Museum and Ark Encounter.
I am sure they do. I am sure
Yeah,
because they're
which
biblical
is
literalists.
very dispiriting. We actually have an article coming out on that. The Amish are not. That's not their tradition, and it's having a real impact, and it's really unfortunate.
Interesting. They are literalists, though, aren't they?
They're biblicists, not
Biblicists,
literalists.
yeah. Okay, yeah, there's a
That's
difference.
different.
Yeah.
But young Earth creationism and Protestant fundamentalism is having a real impact, and it's not great.
I guess not. Well, let me stop talking because everyone who is watching you and I are very anxious to hear your thoughts on the relationships between creationism, conspiracism, QAnon, and other things that we don't like to see in public schools, among other things. So, Susan and William, take it away.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, here we go. So, when we began our research for what became our book, Writing America at the Creation Museum, which Eugenie mentioned, came out in 2016. We expected to encounter a lot of creation science and a lot of Bible at the Creation Museum. And in many ways, we did. In the flood geology area of the museum, for example, there are 38 placards devoted to making the case that Noah's global flood produced in just 1 year all of the geological formations, like the Grand Canyon, that mainstream geologists say took millions of years to form. This argument is crucial for answers in Genesis, AiG, the organization behind the Creation Museum, because they insist that a proper reading of the Bible reveals that God created not only the earth, but the whole universe in 6 24-hour days, less than 10,000 years ago. As for Bible, there are numerous placards in the Garden of Eden section that refer to verses in Genesis. For example, at the spot where visitors encounter Adam waking from his God-induced sleep to see Eve for the first time, they find a placard titled, quote, "God forms Eve from Adam's side," end quote, with a quote from Genesis 2, verses 18 and 22, that says that God wanted Adam to have a helper. So he created Eve out of Adam's rib. On the face of it, the Creation Museum appears to deliver exactly what AiG promises: a contemporary museum that presents modern science on behalf of a literal reading of the Bible. Or does it? In the course of writing the book, we took more than 2,000 photographs of every placard, diorama, and enclosed glass case. In other words, we created a voluminous archive of images that enabled us to interrogate that, in quotes, "on the face of it" impression that there is a lot of science and a lot of Bible at the Creation Museum. What we found was not at all what we expected. Let's start with the science at the Creation Museum. We are not scientists, so we did not attempt to assess the science at the Creation Museum like a geologist or biologist would. Instead, we evaluated the science in the museum against AiG's stated and quite peculiar understanding of science. According to Ken Ham, who is CEO of AiG, real science, real science is observational science, or science that is observable in the present and repeatable. Historical science, by contrast, endeavors to talk about things that happened in the past that cannot be observed in the present or repeated. This distinction is crucial for AiG because it seems to justify their claim that evolution isn't real science. It is historical science, because it is about processes that happened in the past that cannot be observed in the present. Since we can't observe apes turning into humans, so the reasoning goes, then evolution is just a theory. Of course, young earth creationism is also historical science, since it talks about events that happened thousands of years ago. But according to AiG, while we can't observe Eve's creation, God certainly did. And God, the eyewitness, the ultimate eyewitness, dictated the creation story to Moses. This is the clincher argument for young earth creationists. Of course, if all the answers to our questions about creation can be found in Genesis, it is answers in Genesis, after all, then why bother with science? The short answer is that for centuries, in the context of modernity, science has been the discourse of truth. Thus, if you want to have credibility when you claim that young earth creationism is truth, you need some science. And in 1961, that science appeared in the book The Genesis Flood by Henry Morris and John Wickham, which argued that Noah's flood explains why the earth looks millions of years old when it's actually less than 10,000 years old. That is the, in quotes, science at the Creation Museum. But is it observational science? And does it support the claim that the God of the Bible created the universe in 6 24-hour days about 6,000 years ago? In our close analysis of those 38 placards in the flood geology section of the museum, for instance, we found that only 16 meet AIG's criteria for real science. That is, scientific evidence that is observable in the present and can be reproduced. Of those 16, 3 make no connection to a biblical creation. Of the remaining 13, only 7 reason inductively from observations to conclusions, and 4 of these 7 focus on critiquing evolution rather than making a case for a biblical creation. Of the remaining 3, 1 simply suggests that a global flood can explain, in quotes, mysteries observable in the present. So now we're down to 2 placards. The first makes an analogy between observations in the present and the global flood, an analogy that is undermined by a nearby placard that says no such analogies are possible because the flood was a unique event. The second placard simply assumes that a global flood occurred based on the Bible, and then infers from that assumption that the Allosaurus, whose admittedly spectacular skeleton is on display at the museum, died while running up a hill to avoid the rising floodwaters. The folks at AIG insist there is, in quotes, plenty of science in the Creation Museum that supports the claim that the God of the Bible created the universe in 6 24-hour days less than 10,000 years ago. Really? Just 2 extremely problematic placards? That seems more like paucity than plenty. Perhaps the lack of real science at the Creation Museum isn't a problem for AIG because God spoke every word of the Bible, they reason. We don't need scientists to tell us if it's true. In their words, when we're quoting them, if the Bible says something happened, we are to believe it up front, right away, without hesitation, end quote. If evidence emerges that contests what the Bible says, then the evidence must be either wrong or misunderstood. But how are we to know what the Bible says? For AIG, it's simple. It requires understanding 2 concepts, inerrancy and perspicuity. Inerrancy is the proposition that, as AIG puts it, quote, the Bible is divinely inspired and inerrant, including its assertions in such fields as history and science, end quote. Because God spoke every word, there are neither errors nor contradictions. If we mistakenly think we see an error or contradiction, we have to, quote, clear up our own ignorance, end quote. And the Bible is also perspicacious, so clear that everyone, everywhere, and at all times can understand what the text means. According to Tim Chaffee, content manager for AIG's Attractions, all that is required is for readers to take a historical grammatical approach to the Bible. That is, note the quote historical and cultural settings in which the books were written, end quote. Attend to quote standard rules of grammar and ascertain what the author intended the text to mean, end quote. In the words of AIG speaker Brian Edwards, these common sense quote principles are easy to follow, and they are within the reach of everyone who prayerfully and carefully uses them, end quote. Of course, at the Creation Museum, the focus is on the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And according to Ken Ham, quoting him, there is only one view of Genesis. It means what it says. It is written as history and is meant to be taken as history, end quote. Why is this so important to folks at AIG? For them, not to believe that the first few chapters of Genesis is a literally accurate and errorless historical account raises questions about God's trustworthiness and undermines biblical authority. If we don't take literally what the Bible says in Genesis, so the reasoning goes, why would we trust what God said about his plan for our salvation in Jesus Christ? Given this, we thought it worth our time to examine closely AIG's use of the Bible throughout the museum. What we found was not at all what we expected. Yes, there is a lot of Bible on placards, but there is also a lot of creative editing of biblical text, a lack of ellipses to indicate where text has been removed, a failure to provide relevant context for the passages displayed, and lots of interpretation not grounded in the Bible. Consider, for instance, a prominently placed placard in the Tower of Babel room, which displays a text labeled Genesis 11, 1-9. While most museum goers would naturally assume that the text is as labeled, AIG curators have actually eliminated verses 1, 3, 5, 6b, and 9. In the section devoted to the story of Noah building the ark, an animatronic Noah gives instructions to the construction workers. An accompanying placard helpfully suggests, quoting them, after centuries of righteous living, Noah may have been wealthy enough to hire shipbuilders, end quote. How he found shipbuilders far from the coast is left unaddressed. More than this, these, quote, paid workers may have been his audience, as Noah, a preacher of righteousness, warned them of the coming judgment, end quote. The animatronic Noah tries to persuade a nearby worker to join him on the impending voyage. Noah says, "Judgment is coming, my friend, but if you come along, you will be safe on the ark," end quote. Noah's workers were not the only ones who were warned. According to another signboard, quote, the ark itself would have been like a billboard, a bold statement of Noah's faith, forewarning of coming judgment. A large ship built far inland would likely have been known the world over, end quote. It is striking how much of this is not found in Genesis. There is no reference in Genesis to Noah preaching the impending judgment, naysayers mocking Noah, Noah trying to persuade others to join his family on the ark, or anything akin to the ark serving as a billboard of judgment for the entire world. So where is all this coming from? Other placards provide a couple of snippets from the New Testament, but that's it. But if a museum goer isn't paying close attention, they'd mistakenly assume that the museum story can be found in the Bible. These are just two examples. There are many more examples of the museum playing fast and loose with the biblical text. So, what is going on here? A look at the scene in the Garden of Eden in which Eve is created is suggestive. The scene seems biblical enough. God put Adam to sleep so that he could remove a rib from Adam and create Eve. Except, of course, there are two creation accounts in Genesis. In one, there is this story of Eve's creation. In the other account, Adam and Eve are created at the same time. But more than this, consider the placards surrounding the placard with a verse from Genesis. The placard on the left has a quote attributed to Jesus and instruction on how we should interpret it. The placard says, God made male and female fit for different roles from the beginning. And on the other side of that central placard, we get another quote from Jesus and more instruction. The special creation of Adam and Eve is the foundation for marriage, one man and one woman. This is not about getting the Bible right. This is about using the Bible in creative ways to make culture war arguments regarding gay marriage and the proper role of women. Elsewhere in the museum, visitors are told how to understand the history of race in the US. It's not a problem, since, according to AiG, we're all one blood. White Christians, another part of the story, white Christians were liberators in the time of slavery in the US. And abortion is murder, so women should always give birth when pregnant. The Creation Museum's companion site, Ark Encounter, opened in 2016 and features a life-size replica of Noah's Ark. The Ark is massive, and that alone helps make the case that it is reasonable to imagine that two of every kind of animal, not species, could fit on the Ark along with food and other supplies. And while the Ark Encounter is more nuanced in its culture war arguments, they are there. There is, for instance, a placard that argues that God wants capital punishment for murder as well as lesser crimes. There is also an exhibit of children's books that tell a happy story of the flood, which is the wrong story, according to AiG, as the story of the flood needs to be terrifying so that children learn that the Christian God is an angry God who punishes people for their sins, even to the point of genocide. Perhaps the loudest culture war argument that Ark Encounter makes is that the Christian God is a wrathful God. The flood, as described here and at the Creation Museum, was a just punishment by a just God who could no longer bear so much human sin. Thankfully, there was one righteous man on earth, and that was Noah. God directed him to build the ark, and he did. He and his family got on because they were good. Everyone else, including every other land creature, along with every man, woman, child, infant, and the unborn, were drowned in the global flood. The images that you're seeing now are of the door at Ark Encounter. The story is that this is the door through which animals entered the ark. God shut it, and when he shut it, it never reopened. So if you were on the wrong side of the door, you were doomed. To underscore God's willingness to destroy sinners, one LED screen at the ark advances the argument that there were as many as 20 billion people on earth at that time. The point is simple. God smiles on the righteous and slaughters the unrighteous. This very clear binary that defines us young earth creationists as righteous and them, everyone else, as evil, is of course a standard trope in the culture war. And others abound. God's word versus man's reason, the faithful versus the scoffer, obedience versus rebellion, the innocent versus the guilty, Christians versus secular humanists, and skeptics, and so forth.
As Sue already mentioned, our book came out in 2016. In the intervening 8 years, Answers in Genesis has remodeled the Creation Museum, in some places as an apparent response to our book. To give one example, in Writing America, we pointed out that the museum included almost no visual representations of Jesus. 1 year later, there were 3 Jesus rooms in the museum, with much attention on Jesus returning to earth as the great avenger against sinners, and Jesus presiding over the last judgment when sinners are sent to hell. In another example, in our book, we pointed out that a culture war quote that the museum attributed to Martin Luther actually came from a 19th century novel. Within months, that quote was gone. But AIG has done more than remodel the museum. In the last 8 years, they've opened a K-12 school, which uses fundamentalist textbooks from Bob Jones University Press, while also dramatically expanding its online presence. At the same time, AIG has doubled down on fighting the culture war. For example, in March 2021, AIG replaced its original hyper-fundamentalist statement of faith, which included 29 separate provisions, with an even more harsh and even more hyper-fundamentalist document, AIG's faith statement, which all AIG employees and volunteers must affirm. AIG's faith statement now has 46 separate provisions. Many of these provisions involve taking a stand on the far right side of the culture war, with some provisions particularly explicit in this regard. There is, for example, provision number 32, quote, gender and biological sex are equivalent and cannot be separated. A person's gender is determined at conception, fertilization, coded in the DNA. It cannot be changed by drugs, hormones, or surgery. Rejection of one's biological sex, gender, or identifying oneself by the opposite sex is a sinful rejection of the way God made that person, unquote. Then there's provision number 29, quote, the concepts of social justice, intersectionality, and critical race theory are anti-biblical and destructive to human flourishing, unquote. As you can see on the screen, and as with each of the 46 provisions, AIG here lists Bible verses, in this case, Ezekiel 18, 1-20, and James 2, 8 and 9, that supposedly support this idea. But as one finds at the Creation Museum, AIG is playing fast and loose with the Bible. There is nothing in these passages that indicates that social justice, intersectionality, and critical race theory are anti-biblical. But of course, that's beside the point. The goal is not to be true to the biblical text. Instead, the goal is to claim, whatever the evidence or lack of evidence, that the inerrant word of God supports their culture war positions. In keeping with their faith statement, much or most of what one finds in AIG articles, blog posts, videos, and social media entries involves the culture war. There is so much that could be said here, especially regarding sexuality. But we will limit ourselves to 3 other examples. The first has to do with climate change denialism. As K.L. Marshall has pointed out in Revisiting the Scopes Trial, an article on the Scopes Trial, many Protestant fundamentalists and evangelicals, quote, have come to deny anthropogenic climate change and they support their views by pointing to the conclusions produced by creation science, which claims to have its basis in the divine authority of the Bible, unquote. Ken Ham and other AiG writers and speakers are probably the leading creationist producers of climate change denialism. And what they have written about climate change is conveniently a moving target. And in a shout out to Jeannie Scott, the inventor of this term, this is a veritable gish gallop. According to a variety of AiG publications, 1, there is no conclusive evidence that the Earth is warming. 2, but if the Earth is warming, it's not significant and it's not because of human beings. 3, but if the Earth is warming and it is significant, this may be a good thing because it produces longer growing seasons, more food for the hungry, and fewer cold snaps. 4, but if the Earth is warming and it's significant and it's not a good thing, this is simply another chapter in climate history, which is the story of climate change and catastrophe, as we see with Noah's flood. 5, given all this, government needs to focus on law and order, stay out of climate politics, allow capitalism, God's economy, to proceed smoothly. More than all this, God has promised that, quote, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. Genesis 8:22. I should note, by the way, that this verse, which would seem to have nothing to do with global warming, is their one piece of biblical evidence against climate change. And finally, the very end of all this, God and only God will destroy the earth. According to the folks at AiG, people concerned about global warming, quote, have the wrong starting point, man's word, and the wrong history, evolution in millions of years, so they come to wrong conclusions about the future. Zealous climate activism is a false religion. Ham also uses the term climate cult. Climate activism is a false religion with false prophets who are actually anti-Christian leftists driven by politics and greed. In their article on science education in fundamentalist schools, Jenna Scaramanga and Michael Rice have observed that, quote, both climate denialism and creationism are conspiracy theories. In that, quote, when pressed to explain the overwhelming scientific consensus, both the creationist and the climate denier must resort to an imagined cover-up by scientists, unquote. In the same vein, there is a good deal of evidence that those who deny climate change are more likely to deny the reality of the coronavirus pandemic and the efficacy of vaccinations. This is certainly the case with Answers in Genesis. For example, in August 2020, Georgia Perdome, AiG's token female spokesperson, joined with Heidi St. John on the latter's podcast to attack the evangelical science organization BioLogos for putting out a statement arguing that Christians should respond to COVID by wearing a mask and getting vaccinated. These two fundamentalists blasted BioLogos for being emotionally and spiritually manipulative, hypocrites of the highest order, and extremely deceptive. According to AiG's Perdome, BioLogos is, quote, concerned about a virus that doesn't kill very many people at all, unquote. More than this, Perdome asserted that BioLogos was wrong to say that, quote, Christians should listen to scientists and doctors when it comes to vaccinations. Not only are vaccines unnecessary, she says, but appeals to authority are logical fallacies. Just a note. Not only are appeals to authority not logical fallacies, but the essence of the young earth creationist argument completely depends on appeals to biblical authority. That is to say, the absurdity of this argument is obvious. But Ken Ham joined in, rejecting the so-called scientific consensus on the efficacy of vaccinations. More than this, Ham understood the concerns with COVID as an opportunity for government and others to persecute Christians. As he blogged in September 2020, "This is war. And even though it seems we hear nothing but coronavirus stories and statistics in the news, we need to be reminded of the spiritual war raging around us and the enormous threat to Christian freedom in the West. One of the things the coronavirus situation has shown me is how easy it is for one person, like a state governor, for instance, to close down church buildings overnight. And we've seen blatant discrimination by certain leaders of the community to stop Christians from worshiping." For Ham, the real heroes are fundamentalist preachers like John MacArthur, the same John MacArthur who has repeatedly asserted that the pandemic was a satanic deception and who now claims that mental illness is an invention of psychologists and the pharmaceutical industry. Anyway, for Ham, MacArthur's a hero because he stood against the forces of anti-Christian persecution and kept his church doors open. Finally, we come to the QAnon conspiracy, which, as you know, holds that, quote, "the American government, media, and financial institutions are controlled by Satan-worshiping pedophiles who maintain a global child sex trafficking operation. A storm is coming that will sweep away the elites and put the rightful leaders in charge. And true patriots may need to use violence to save America from these satanic pedophiles." According to a 2021 poll, 27% of white evangelicals, more than any single demographic in the population, 27% of white evangelicals believe this conspiracy theory to be true. While Answers in Genesis has not, as far as we know, come out and explicitly endorse the truth of the QAnon conspiracy, it certainly does its part to encourage folks to head down the QAnon rabbit hole with frequent reference in blog posts and videos to pedophilia and sexual predation. Ken Ham has asserted again and again that those who hold to a secular worldview are in favor of euthanasia, gay marriage, abortion, and pedophilia. Then there's a May 2022 AiG YouTube video in which the three commentators, including the aforementioned Georgia Perdome, discuss at length how, quote, "social emotional learning, an approach to teaching which they say is prevalent in public schools, is a form of grooming children for sexual predation. First, they, all caps, they try to murder a child via abortion, and when they don't get to do that, they try to destroy them." All this comes together in Trey Smith's The Coming Storm, a Donald J. Trump documentary inside Noah's Ark, which was filmed at Ark Encounter in the summer of 2020. And Smith, who you see here, a very enthusiastic Smith, includes lots of praise for Ken Ham and his big boat. He is very grateful. This is one weird and frightening and almost unwatchable viewing experience. Excuse me. I'll say it again. This is one weird and frightening and almost unwatchable viewing experience. Given Smith's determination to bring his face as close as possible to the camera, and given that, height of the pandemic notwithstanding, virtually none of the Ark tourists whom viewers can see are wearing masks. Of course, it's no accident that the video's title is virtually identical to QAnon's frequently used motto, "The storm is coming." The storm referring here to Donald Trump's supposed project of cleaning the swamp of America-hating and child sex trafficking Democrats, liberals, and other tools of the deep state. Smith makes clear that Trump is America's rightful leader, and God has commanded that Donald Trump shall have 2 terms as president. The implication is not subtle. If Trump does not have his second term, it will have been stolen from him. That AIG's Ark Encounter is the site of a QAnon video is not shocking in the least, given that it's not much of a leap for young Earth creationists to head down the QAnon rabbit hole. In the words of Paul Bratterman, University of Glasgow professor emeritus in chemistry, actually Paul might be with us this evening, QAnon and young Earth creationism are both conspiracy theories. Regarding the latter, and I'm quoting Braderman, it meets all the criteria, offering a complete parallel universe with its own organizations and rules of evidence, and claims that the scientific establishment promoting evolution is an arrogant and morally corrupt elite. Like other conspiracy theories, creationists immune themselves from fact-based criticism. In fact, all these conspiracy theories, climate denialism, COVID anti-vax, QAnon, young earth creationism, are at Answers in Genesis wrapped into one rather tight conspiratorial package. And to the outside observer, all of this can seem absolutely and hilariously ridiculous. But this is no laughing matter, and we have to pay attention. Answers in Genesis seeks to shape Christianity and Christians in powerful ways that have had and will have a lasting impact on American life. All of us have a stake in understanding what is happening in AIG's virtual space and at the Creation Museum and Ark Encounter. All of us have a stake in understanding how they're preparing and arming crusaders for the ongoing culture war that polarizes and poisons U.S. religion and politics. Put simply, as bizarre as the creationist melange of conspiracy theories may seem to those of us who are on the outside, what happens in the world of AIG and young earth creationism matters to all of us. That's it for our presentation.
Whoops, there we go. Oh.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us.
And we look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you for thank you so much for being with us tonight. While we wait for the questions to be posted for us, let me just ask a few things, because there are a lot of things to think about in your talk, certainly. Sue, your professional area, which I neglected to mention in the introduction, really is rhetoric. I mean, that's what you do within the English canon, as it were.
Yes.
Have you noticed anything different about the way that young earth creationists, say, shape and present their arguments versus, say, other conspirators, other climate science denialists, say, or even is there anything that stands out to you about creationist rhetoric?
I haven't studied other conspiracy rhetorics, so I can't make a comparison. What I can say is that it's so striking to me, the mobilization by young earth creationists. They accuse their opponents of fallacies all the time, and they mobilize fallacies constantly. So they do it's ad hominem all the time, right? So if you don't agree with them, then the problem is that you're a bad person, and no one should listen to anything that you say. Right. I mean, that is, I think, one of the most common tropes among younger, and it wouldn't surprise me if that were true of folks, of others who do conspiracy stuff, but that's just not been an area of research for me.
Yeah, it is a complicated area of research, certainly, and I wouldn't expect you to know everything, but rhetoric is extremely important in these kinds of social controversies, because it's how ideas get spread, and there's a natural selection, if you will, or social selection for the ideas that are packaged in the way that resonate the best. And it's kind of interesting when you think about that, because young earth creationism, I think, in the past anyway, it punches above its weight. It's always been a minority social movement. It's certainly a minority of Christians, which actually comes, as a surprise to many members of the American public who don't realize that, biblical literalist six-day creation is not traditional American Christianity. This is, Bill's area, of course, fundamentalism, that kind of started the whole inerrancy and eventual literacy kind of bug that affected American Christianity in the early part of the 20th century. So it's a fascinating history. But yeah, it's I wish I knew more about rhetoric. I wish I knew more about your field, because I think it is very important for us all to understand how we are being manipulated.
Yeah.
I was interested in both of your comments about the presentation of God at the Creation Museum and the Ark Park, for all of that. I mean, it is a really wrathful God.
Yes.
And that even that wrathful God also, I think, shows up. Correct me if you disagree. When you were talking about their views toward climate change acceptors, people, the fanatics who think that the world is changing and it's anthropogenic. It's the anthropogenicity, easy for you to say, I think, that really gets them.
Yes.
Yeah. But I think the wrathful God kind of slips into this part too. I mean, what I understood about the religiously based anti-climate change movement, which again is much smaller than the political and economically based one, but the religiously based one, I think, partly rests on the accusation of hubris. How is it that you, pitiful humankind, could possibly think that you could affect this planet in a significant enough way that would cause harm to God's creation? And God is never going to let anything go wrong with his creation, and human beings are just silly to think that they could do anything about that. That's not really the wrathful God, but that certainly is the omnipotent God. Who really, I mean, does that sound familiar to you, or is that
a really, really great book on this question? Yeah, written by Doug Frank. The title is A Gentler God. And what he talks about, he grew up evangelical, and he talks about the duplicity of the evangelical God, right? So it's the evangelical God, fundamentalist God, is both wrathful, right, and loves you, right?
well?
So
Isn't that sort of an Old Testament, New Testament kind of dichotomy too?
I don't think but he doesn't put it down that way. He just says that he reflects on his own experience growing up evangelical, fundamentalist, whatever, and talks about how you're told both things. God loves you, right? God it's like the secret church thing. But then you get in there and then you find out, oh no, God is pissed off at you, right? You're going to burn in hell. Right. So it's a real psychological nightmare. Right. And he talks about how hard it is to get out of that theology and the duplicity of God, that God loves you and wants to save you and wants you to spend eternity in heaven. And also God hates you and thinks you're horrible and is happy for you to burn in hell. It's really messed up.
And speaking of the wrathful God, it is really striking how Ark Encounter takes that to a new level.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat that I'm going to respond to here about how they came up with the 20 billion.
Oh my gosh.
And
and
they have this mathematical formula. We're guessing that they built it on the idea that human beings live to 500 or 600.
Yeah.
This is pre.
Yeah. And you're going to reproduce a whole bunch at that point.
When does menopause hit? I mean, maybe like when you're 450.
But it's
biologists talk about something called the intrinsic rate of increase, and if you're going to live until you're 500 and 600 years old, that really goes up.
And that's But what's so striking is they double down on the wrathful God.
Right.
Yeah.
That you don't see these numbers at the Creation Museum, which was built 9 years before, but you see them at Ark Encounter. When Sue and I first saw that, we were just stunned, because that takes away, for example, any argument that Noah was trying to save people.
Right.
20 billion.
How's he preaching to 20 billion people?
Right. It is just striking. But what happens, Jeannie, is that you get into the Ark, and the idea is that you're on the inside. You're saved. You're saved. And so you have, Sue showed the photo at the door that God shut. they have keepsake photo site.
Yeah, they have a placard that says, "Hey, take your keepsake photo at the door."
Every time we've been, we are so tempted to go up and just say, "Do you understand that according to these folks who put this thing together, on the other side of that door, 20 billion people, up to 20 billion people are drowning."
It's also just remarkable that this includes the unborn, who, according to these folks,
Yes.
are the only innocent humans
Yeah.
that exist, right? But if you have 20 billion people, if half of them are women, right? But I mean, you got a lot of unborn, and they're drowning too.
But it is a real doubling down on the wrathful God.
Well, you mentioned that they revised the Ark Encounter, and there are some things that they appear to have been inspired by your book to make some corrections, including bringing Jesus into the mix as an actual character as opposed to just being mentioned in the text. And, I mean, that when you mentioned that Jesus is leading the apocalypse with his flaming sword, I mean, yeah, that's pretty stunning. That was not there when I visited the Ark Encounter.
Well, this is actually at the Creation Museum, not
Well, that's it. Same. That was not there when I visited the Creation
But
Museum.
no, it's Jesus as superhero.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which is actually a kind of popular thing with young, like teenage Christians, isn't it? I mean, isn't that part of there's a whole, we talked about Amish literature. I mentioned Amish literature in the intro. Young Christian, young adult Christian literature does have that genre of the wrathful Jesus coming in to straighten out everybody.
Right.
Except for us, of course, because we've already been saved and, we're the good guys.
Right.
And wow.
That's right.
Yeah, it's fascinating theologically. It's scary from a scientific standpoint because, as you say, what science they do have is pretty distorted. But I find that friends and colleagues of mine who are scientists go to the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter and they kind of roll their eyes. Friends of mine who are theologians and members of religious denominations just go berserk because it is so much more offensive to them than it is to scientists. And that is what I find. And then my friends who are scientists who are, theologically inclined, they have two reasons to dislike these institutions. So they get after them much stronger than I do. Anyway. I have a feeling we probably have some questions that, although I love to talk with you guys, we should really let some of our YouTube viewers watch. How many AIG employees died of COVID? At least Ark's designer Marsh and their physician, Dr. David Menton. Do you know of any more? And this is from Dan Phelps, who, by the way, is a remarkably astute observer of answers in Genesis in all aspects.
We love
Dan.
We love Dan Phelps.
Yeah.
Hi, Dan.
We all love Dan. Nice to see you here today.
It's a great question, Dan. I have wondered, and as you know very well, they did everything they could to kind of hush up the fact that they died of COVID, and we don't know. We don't have access to that, but we have no doubt that there were others, of course.
Sure.
It would be surprising if there weren't.
Right.
Since they weren't taking precautions. And as you pointed out, they were discouraging vaccinations as well. And it's thank you, Dan, for that question. Andrew Fracknoy. Hello, Andy. Nice to have you here. Is there anything in the museum about astronomy? The delay in starlight across great distances, measures of the age of the universe, the date from observation of the expanding universe. Do they deal with the dilution of time, shall we say?
They have, so in our book, we go through various videos that they have in the flood geology room. And, we document in the book how their arguments don't make sense. But of course, we were really clear in the book. We're not scientists. We're not assessing. We're not trying to evaluate what they put forward as science against mainstream science. But when you put it up against just and this is where where my training in rhetoric really came in, was just to say, here are the arguments that they're making, and against their own criteria, it doesn't work.
Right. And Andrew, they don't do so much with astronomy in the museum. They do a lot in print. But I have to say, echoing Sue, okay, I don't have to be a scientist to know that it doesn't make sense.
Right.
I cannot understand what they're saying. Right. But the point is, actually, it's not about science.
No.
They've this conviction, this argument to make, and it doesn't make any difference whether it makes sense or not. That's why you get these Bible verses appended to things that it doesn't make it. There's no reference there, right. But that doesn't matter. The point is to make the argument. And I should add one more thing here that we didn't mention, because I see a question about the Institute for Creation Research.
Yeah.
ICR was designed to create a creation science.
Yeah.
And it has been,
and to publish a journal.
Yes.
With creation science in it that was like legit.
And this has proven
this was the research arm of the movement.
Yes.
That's correct.
And it has proven to be sadly lacking. But Ken Ham figured out that it's not science it's not creation science that will bring people in. It's politics. It's culture war. This is one of our arguments in the book. So he's got this patina of this pseudoscience, but really this is about politics and culture war. That has worked.
Yeah.
That has worked.
Well, religion. I mean, it's all about saving souls.
But
I mean, the ICR wanted to save souls too, but they had a much more genteel way of going about it.
Yes.
I think.
Yes.
But AIG.
Although they also have been, they have moved into the culture wars more in the last 5 or 6 years than they had previously. Yeah. Onward and upward. Jay asks, was there any warning or run-up to the Donald J. Trump documentary? Regardless of questionable Bible references, this seems like a massive political turn out of nowhere.
I'm not familiar with it. Are you?
Oh, that's the
one you mentioned.
That's the QAnon video. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jay, this is the QAnon video. I shouldn't laugh. I'm the one who said we shouldn't be laughing at this, but that video is so bad that it was very hard to sit through it. Actually, I would say there was a lot of run up to this. Ken Ham has been, and AIG has been very clear where they stand politically, pro-Trump. They've been very clear.
Oh, for sure.
In contrast, there have been photos of Biden on their website with the word enemy on his forehead. They're not subtle.
Yeah.
So to me, it was just another step in their politicization. And Ham is smart enough not to come right out and say, we hold the QAnon, but you open the Ark for a QAnon documentary. Moreover, I have not seen one negative word about QAnon in AIG. Anyway, I just think, Jay, I think this was, there's a way in which this was a logical culmination, but it's for those of you, it's worth, if you can stand it, it's worth looking at that thing.
Where find this if one was so demented to do so?
It's online, but also
it's on YouTube.
YouTube?
Yeah.
Is there a YouTube?
I think so. And if somebody wanted it, they could contact it because I've got a link to it, unless they've discontinued it. It's so unbelievable. Okay, I'll quit laughing about it. I apologize. That's inappropriate.
Okay. RYV says, thank you for the presentation, and we do thank you. In your experience, what seems the most effective path to drawing out the realization of unfalsifiable logic, at least planting the seeds of critical thoughts?
This is something thank you for that question. This is something we've really wrestled with. The depressing part of my answer is that it seems to require one-on-one conversation, that there isn't some magic formula to pull people out. But when you read stories of people who've come out of this, it's because of it's sort of at this personal level. And so I don't find that good news. I wish we had a formula that would get people out of this. But I think it is possible. It's slow work and it's individual work.
There is a wonderful film out there.
Yes.
We Believe in Dinosaurs.
Dan Phelps is featured in it.
It's a fantastic film, and it tells the story of a young man who was a card-carrying supporter of the Creation Museum. His name is actually on a plaque because he donated early on, right? And he still has his Creation Museum or whatever card in his wallet. But he read, right? He read stuff and thought, wait a minute, I don't think this makes sense anymore, right? I mean, he was in the bubble. And whenever, he was determined to defend young Earth creationism. So if someone would pose a question, if he didn't have the answer, he'd go read some Ken Ham book and he'd get the answer, and then he'd go back.
Yeah.
And then at some point he just started reading other stuff.
Right.
We know of one of the wife of one of your graduate students who read our book, right? And she was big time into all of this. And then she thought, wait a minute, maybe this doesn't make sense. Maybe I should reconsider. But, it's why we do the work we do, right? But if you can, We Believe in Dinosaurs is such a fine documentary. If you haven't seen it, we strongly recommend it. It's really good.
And Jeannie, can I respond to a question from James Rice? I see here on the screen.
It sounds like young Earth creationism has become more militant over time, although I know it's always been close to anti-communism. What are some potential causal factors for that militancy?
Okay, so Rice has two questions, and I'd like to answer both of them. We'll start with this one. Yes, it has been. It's always been connected with anti-communism from the beginning. It's always been on the far right edge politically. Carl Weinberg, Weinberg, has a fantastic book on this point. I've lost the name of it.
Oh, it's so good. I can find it.
Okay.
Oh, go get it.
But causal factors that's very interesting. I think my answer would be that young Earth creationism has always been tied to an understanding that America is losing its way. And evolution is a big factor in that. And so it made sense to latch on to anti-communism. But your question's a very good one, and you're right. That would be my argument for a potential causal factor for the militancy. Regarding your other question, yes, it does. So Jeannie mentioned my mentor, Ron Numbers, and Ron did a ton of work on global creationism. It is global. There are people who still think it's just an American phenomenon, and they're wrong. Here's a little factoid that I find very interesting. There are more young Earth creationists per capita in South Korea than in the United States.
Yes.
So it's found everywhere. And I'll just make a shameless plug. Writing America at the Creation Museum is being translated into Russian.
Cool.
And the argument was, we never thought of it. It wasn't our idea. We were approached. And the argument is that the Eastern Europe and Russia have a lot of creationists, and that there'd be a real market for this book. So it's global. It's global.
It definitely is.
Yeah.
Although it is, I mean, it's tied with religion revivalisms around the world.
Yes.
Obviously, it's associated with Christian faith. There is an Islamic creationism, but it might have been inspired by the young earthers, by the ICR back in the 60s, but it's evolved to be its own thing.
Right.
And it's much more closely associated with politics than is Christian creationism.
And by the way, the reason South Korea has that per capita is because of fundamentalist missionaries from the States.
Yep. And that's also the reason why Eastern Europe is so full of creationists.
Yes.
Because back in 30 years ago, at the fall of the Soviet Union and the opening up of Eastern Europe and the breaking apart of the Russian Empire, as it were, everybody wanted to learn English. And who are the people that came in to teach them English? Christian missionaries. And they tended not to be Catholics. They tended to be, conservative Protestant Christians. And you want to learn English? Well, here's some books you can read. And it was creationist books. So, it kind of came as a package for learning English back at the fall of the Soviet Empire. So,
and I just learned from a Slavic scholar here at University of Dayton that it has really entered the Orthodox Church, Eastern Orthodox Church.
Yes, I hear that as well. Yeah. Which is that was not the case 20 years ago.
No, it was not.
It really wasn't. In fact, I remember back when I was still at NCSE, and so now we're talking at least 20 years ago, when this event took place, where there was a problem with creationism in Serbia, where basically the equivalent of the Secretary of Education, but it was sort of like a superintendent of education, because it's a smaller country, more like a state. And she happened to be a conservative Protestant Christian. And she, came in and announced that we weren't going to be studying evolution anymore. And of course, scientists in Serbia and educators as well, what up with this we will not put. And there was a big fight. And the Orthodox Church, maybe for, competition religion, shall we say, from Protestant Western Christianity, who knows? But the Orthodox Church was on the side of the scientists. They said, no, evolution's fine. Our students need to be well educated in order to compete in the modern world, et cetera, et cetera. But I think, I have also heard that that's changed in the last maybe 15 years. I mean, it's been slow. Anyway, well, we may have one more question. And this is Rob 11 says, I haven't heard anything about Q lately. Is he still active? By Q, he means the Q, the human being who supposedly made all the Q drops and like that. Any insight into the QAnon movement itself?
I mean, yeah, that's a great question. We have not heard anything about Q lately either. But it's not that the QAnon conspiracy idea is fading. It's just, but we haven't gotten. I gather your question is about the Q speaker, the person putting out this stuff, and we have not either.
Oh, here's a good question. There are many missionaries across Africa. Do you know if YAC is blossoming there too? Yes.
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 I mean, once you have conservative evangelical / fundamentalist missionaries, you have a good chance of having young earth creationism spread.
Yeah.
And it's very important to understand that it's presented as if you're going to be a true Christian, you have to hold to this.
Yeah. That's the story.
Which, of course, brings up this idea of competition within Christianity.
Yeah.
And I think that's pushing the Catholics in West Africa to be more conservative as well.
And Catholics in the U.S. as well.
Not quite so much, I don't think, in the U.S., because the creationist movement is still such a minority movement in the United States. I could be wrong about that, but certainly in West Africa, there's a lot of competition for Catholics from conservative Protestant Christians.
Yeah, our priest would tell you that. I mean, he's working hard to keep it at bay.
Yeah, I'm not at all surprised.
It's very challenging.
Well, folks, this has been so much fun. I mean, I have to say, when our mutual friend Glenn Branch suggested, hey, you really ought to get the Trolling Jews to speak, I thought, And we get to talk about creationists. But it's lovely the way you tied in the other conspiracies. And certainly conspiracism underscores, as you say, all of these, you know, if you accept climate science, you just believed in, you've been sucked in by that controversy of that conspiracy of the climate scientists.
Yeah.
Like scientists could actually keep secrets, give me a break.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. And don't worry about the tornadoes. Just don't worry about it. It's all fine.
Right, exactly. Or punishments from God.
Yeah.
My friends, thank you. Thank you very much for being with us tonight.
This has been such a joy. Thank you very much. It's such an honor.
Thank you. All right. Now, folks, those of you remaining, join us next month on the second Thursday of June, June 13, when our guest will be the distinguished political scientist John Miller of the University of Michigan. Now, there's been a lot of commentary in the last couple of years about the supposed rejection of science by Americans. Dr. Miller has been studying American attitudes towards science and understanding of scientific concepts for over 50 years. He's going to share with us some of his insights and understandings about what Americans really think about science. So join us next month. I'll see you here. I believe it's 7:30, but do check the information that we'll be sending out about it. Thank you for coming a half hour early. We often will do that when we have speakers from the East Coast. Thank you for coming tonight, and I look forward to seeing you next month. Good night.